evening, everyone. My name is Paul O'Neill, and on behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures, I'd like to welcome you here tonight to our most recent, tonight's presentation of our lecture series. The subject tonight is immigration and the role that immigration has played in our communal character. We're a nation of immigrants, and here in Kingston, we are most certainly a community of immigrants. And when we talk about immigration, we're not simply talking about an influx of different groups, different ethnic groups and races. We're also talking about any new group that comes in and brings new ideas, new goals, even new views on education. Our history has a number of periods of immigration, starting from the original settlement by the Dutch in 1652 and continuing till today. Our immigration has been marked by periods in our history such as the D&H Canal and even the arrival of IBM. We cannot overstate the importance of immigration in our community's history. We are very fortunate to have as our presenter tonight Tom Hoffay. And Tom is not only a member of Kingston's Buried Treasures, he's our former Kingston City Common Council Majority Leader, and he currently works with our State Assemblyman Kevin Cahill, who is also a former presenter for Kingston's Buried Treasures. So it is a great honor to introduce to you tonight our featured presenter, Tom Hoffay.
How do you follow, an introduction by Paul O'Neill? He gives you a little taste of what it's going to be about. He gets you going, and then he builds you up, then he walks off stage and probably chuckles to himself on the way off, like, follow that one, let's see. But Paul is certainly the guy who has been the spirit, the heart of this whole series. We're at number 22 tonight, and it is really a testament to Paul and his determination and his creativity that he has kept this going and kept a level of professionalism with the series that has been very inspiring and something that people look forward to on this Friday of every month. So tonight it's about immigration, and it's largely about the 19th century. And there was a lot of history happening in Europe in the 19th century. And like Rob Sweeney's very excellent presentation last month about the old Dutch church, sometimes you have to go backward before you go forward. People came here not necessarily for job opportunities. We weren't talking about IBM at that point. People came here to leave somewhere else, because of some other reason. They were leaving their homes, they were leaving the comfort of a life they knew, and were entering on this adventure. And one other thing, and I think this is my takeaway for tonight that I want to focus this around. We don't have, the people in this room, even collectively, don't have much of a contact with the 17th century. We really didn't know, with the exception possibly of Ed Ford, didn't know anyone, and we'll talk about that later, anyone in the 17th century. We didn't hear the stories firsthand. We didn't have the ability to know the people. But for many of us in this room, we have some contact with the 19th century. We grew up at a time when people from the 19th century made up part of our families. They were relatives. They told us stories. Maybe we grew up in a house that was a 19th century house and still decorated from its first owners. Maybe we personally looked at photographs from the 19th century and we heard the stories. So we can touch the 19th century in a way that we aren't able maybe to communicate with the centuries that preceded it. And that's important because sometimes history is a very interesting intellectual experience, but when it's really good, it's an emotional experience. It's a story. It's something we can touch, and that touches us. And I think we have the opportunity tonight to look at that and be touched by history. So I'm going to start right here with this slide. And some of you may recognize it, but I would think that maybe many of you do not. And it is called a Celtic cross. It is a large standing Celtic cross, and it's on the grounds of St. Mary's Church, right on Broadway in Kingston at the top of the hill coming up from the roundabout, and it looks down on the roundabout. It's not an old cross. It was put in there 5-7 years ago by members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And I would urge you, if you have the opportunity, to make a trip there and park your car and get out and walk around. It is in a very impressive setting. And as you walk around that piece of granite and look at it, you will notice on the front of the stone are the words, and I think I'm pronouncing them correctly, An Gorta Moor. And in the Gaelic, the Irish Gaelic, the word moor means great, large, great. And the word gorta means hunger. And this cross is dedicated 150 years after the Irish famine. It is dedicated by families that came to the city of Kingston because of that famine, and they are remembering something that for almost 150 years was never the subject of a conversation, and that was the Great Hunger. Because when you say it was the potato famine, you put a label on it that's curious, but maybe not imperative. But you call it the Great Hunger, and you make it personal to yourself, to your family, to your people. And the cross there at St. Mary's is meant to say, our people experienced the Great Hunger. Our people left on ships across the Atlantic Ocean that were called coffin ships. Our people gave up everything they knew and never turned to look back and plunged themselves into a new life at great cost, and slowly, carefully, over generations, built an entire new identity right here in the city of Kingston. It is not the only monument. Practically every city that has a significant Irish population has a monument now to the Great Hunger. And I mention that because when it happened, it was so shameful, it was so overwhelming and consequential that it was not spoken of by families. Families came here and never mentioned relatives who had died in the hunger, never mentioned what it took to escape Ireland or what they went through. And it was only when there was this emotional distance that they could look at that and say, you know, we need to remember the people who suffered in the hunger. So the stones, the rough cut stones, the upper left-hand side is especially important to us, and that is the one that is in Lower Manhattan. It was designed, it was quite an interesting story about its design and how it came to be. But it's down there and it faces the water, and it is a very, when you look at it, it does not look like a monument. It looks as if it is a crumbling old building that's set in the side of a hill with rather unkempt vegetation, and you're like, well, gee, that's not much, until you get there. And you actually go down through the tunnel, and you see the names, and you hear the story. But that represents the size of a typical Irish farm, and therein lies the story of the famine. Because, you know, I love Downton Abbey. I love the vista of Downton Abbey. I love the lifestyle and the perspective, and that was repeated, and it's referred to in the series. Excuse me. That was repeated over and over again throughout Ireland. Those great estates were all over Ireland, and that was one Ireland, and that is not the Ireland of the famine, because the cows continued to produce milk, and the corn continued to grow, and the grain was harvested. none of it was impacted by the famine. The famine touched the potato. It touched only the potato, but it touched the potato completely. And over the course of those 5 or 6 years, an entire population that was dependent strictly on the potato for its sustenance perished. And that was the other Ireland, the Ireland of the great majority of the people. And they lived in little parcels like that because the land was not inherited, the ones who owned land, by the eldest son. The land was divided between all of the children. So in order to survive, one of the sons would go off to the church, or a daughter would go off to a convent, and some would emigrate and some would leave, but the remaining children divided up whatever was inherited, and the parcels got smaller and smaller and moved further and further up into the hills, so that their diet was strictly a potato diet, which sustained them, and the population multiplied to about 8 million. When the famine hit in the 1840s and went right through the middle of the 1840s, the population suffered 1 million people who died of starvation and starvation-related diseases. 1 million people perished in those small cottages. Entire families would be found in the cottages. People would be found along the wayside. And that lower representation, which I believe is in Dublin, is a testament to the condition. They were walking cadavers, and they knew extraordinary shame, and they felt this pain, and their only hope was to leave that country. So 1 million of them did. So you're talking about 1/4 of the population immediately impacted, and 1 million Irish people left that country and went first to England, a lot to Australia, a lot to Canada, and a lot to the United States. And a lot of them came here to Kingston, hence that Irish cross. And we'll come back to their story in just a little bit. But I'm going to jump ahead on you. And you see this gentleman, Carl Shirtz, and you may recognize his name, at least, because it's in a park that is named for him on the east side of Manhattan. The Gracie Mansion was built, and the mayors of New York City live. It was named for him because he was the Secretary of the Interior. And he was Secretary of the Interior after he had been a United States Senator. But before he did any of those things, he was a revolutionary leader at 19 years of age inside one of the many multiple nation states that together made up Germany. And that revolution swept through Europe in the 1840s, 48 specifically, 47, 48, which resulted in an enormous amount of democracy occurring in the German states, especially around the university cities. And you had calls for allowing people to vote. You had calls for an end to some of the taxation. You had calls for representative parliaments. These are things in the course of the German states they had known at various times, but you also had this nationalistic impulse that said, we need to be a nation, we need to have some democratic reforms, we need to get rid of some of the the different land barons that had ruled over them for centuries. And this involved especially the well-educated German youth. And he was one of them. And when those revolts were crushed in 1848, 1849, an extraordinary number of Germans, especially the younger Germans, were forced to flee from those states. And crushed they were. And we'll come back to and look at the state of Baden-Baden and look at some of the things that happened there. Germany did come out of this period of time with a new sense of nationalism in it, and it's interesting, Joe Tantillo has put some of the national flags to make identifying the slides a little easier, but the German flag actually dates to that period of time. And what happened was that some of the states, you had the old Austrian Empire falling apart, you had Prussia emerging as a main militaristic power, you had a whole assortment of these different little duchies that were there, but they came together under Prussian leadership, and it was the Prussian army that rolled into town and suppressed these demonstrations and suppressed some of these movements towards democracy. Those people, those young idealistic, very educated people came to the United States. And they had a tremendous impact on our universities, on our politics, and on our communities. And certainly Carl Shirtz did. So he came over here, fled right after 1849. He comes over here, he gets involved in politics, travels all over, ends up in New York City after he does his time as Secretary of the Interior, had served in the Civil War, made enormous contributions to the new country, and brought that lifelong crusade about democracy and about reform with him. We'll have a little break here for some Kingston beer, you know. And the last one that I think is really key, 19th century guy, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Now, he's a very interesting character, and these were not people who stayed in place. They were world travelers. And he starts off, Italy was also in that state of being divided up in all these little feudal city-states and republics, and they're owned by this one or this royal family, and the French were very involved, and the Austrian monarchy was very involved. So there was a sense of Italian yearning for unity, a nationalism that is very typical of 19th century Europe. And he was one of the leaders of it, and he was a seaman and a licensed, recognized captain of ships, and he sailed all over the globe. But what he liked to do more than anything else was he was considered at the end the sword of the unification of Italy. And he was involved in revolts and fights down in Brazil. He went sailing off towards China. He lived in New York City again. He actually worked for a while in Staten Island. But it kept going back to Italy and working with various factions in Italy to bring about an Italian republic. The first time it didn't work, and he got exiled. He got out with his head intact. But he went back, and the second time, what he did was he aligned himself with the house. It was the House of Savoy, and it was King Victor Emmanuel, and he became the first king of a reunited Italy, and it was due to Giuseppe Garibaldi. And we'll see some of the Kingston connections with that as well. So let's talk about the immediate and very visible impact of this immigration process. And as a 19th century phenomenon, I would like you to now put yourselves in the shoes of the Dutch settlers. It is 1820 in Kingston. There is one church, the Dutch Reformed Protestant Church that we heard about last month. It is a church that has preserved some of the Dutch language, a great many of the Dutch customs. The culture is this combination of English and Dutch revolutionary spirit. These were important people. They had the first governor of New York State had lived here. He was vice president of the United States. So even though this was a relatively small agricultural settlement, it had enormous political influence in the Hudson Valley, New York State, and nationwide. So this population, and I wrote down the numbers here, was approximately 3,000 people. You knew everybody. You were probably related to everybody. You had a nice, substantial, sturdy stone house, increasingly with the prosperity of the production of food in the Rondout Valley and the Esopus Valley. They were now brick houses. They had gone from the original Dutch type to a more federal standard. You had a settled, secure way of life, and it was predictable, and you liked it. Over the course of the next 40 years, so let's say by 1855, 1860, the population of the area increased by 500%. 500%. So now you were talking about over 16,000 people who were living in the same area that 3,000 had been just a short period of time before. Now, this is not just having a big housing project and having IBM move into the neighborhood and all these high-end workers come in and buy beautiful homes. This was ships and trains arriving every single day from the port of New York and bringing with them people which you had no identification with at all. And I'd like to think that this month's presentation is called, Rome Rises, as opposed to Rob Sweeney's talk about Holland and the Dutch Protestant Church. This is Catholicism Comes to Kingston. Because the overwhelming number were Catholic, and they brought that religion with them, and this was very strange. If you had been growing up in Kingston and working on a farm and going to the Dutch church and observing their customs and knowing their culture, this was the equivalent of someone coming down from another planet and moving into your neighborhood. They did not speak your language, and that was key. Over half the people of the Rondout area were foreign-born. So they definitely came here from somewhere else with the clothes on their back and a different language and a different religion, and they were not arriving down at those docks. So you perceived, of course, that your way of life was threatened. It was visceral. It was like, I don't like this. Where are they coming from? Why are they coming here? And this was a scene that was repeated all up and down the east coast of the United States, right to New Orleans. And, right from New Orleans up through Montreal. These boatloads arrived, and they were sick on the boats. They brought disease. There was an enormous number that were immediately isolated, and who died in isolation and never got to the New World, never put foot on the mainland, but died on these islands. And there are memorials up in Montreal to an island that served as a detention center for people who were detained because they were ill, and they didn't want that coming to the population. So you had a clash that went on in the first part of the 19th century that would shape the city of Kingston, certainly for the next 100 years. And because it is human nature, you had a tremendous reaction from people who lived here already. So the Know Nothing Party was very active here. And although Rondout was quickly overwhelmed with immigrants, and the Rondout was considered more of a Wild West type town down on the waterfront, and there were companies down there like the D&H Canal. It opened in 1828. It was there as an employer. You had employment opportunities. People were going to live right by where they went to work, and habitations grew up the side of the hillsides. This was something familiar to them. So you had people who formed ghetto, which is, you know, a term for people who tend to live together and culturally stay together. But you had the village of Kingston up on top of the hill, and the village was the stronghold of the Dutch church and the stronghold of a Protestant population that was politically influential. And so when the Know Nothing Party went through uptown Kingston and promised to, you know, be stricter, enforce health regulations, enforce building codes, don't let these people overwhelm you. We have a rich legacy. By 1850, you had a very rich legacy, historic legacy already in Kingston. They were listened to. And so in addition to the No Irish Need Apply signs that went up and that you've probably heard about in storefronts that, you know, if you're Irish, don't even come in here looking for a job. You had the Know Nothing Party sweeping to power in 1855, and they took over village government in the village of Kingston. And they were there with one intention: let's keep as many of these immigrants out as we can possibly do. And Rob told a great story, because if you were here, you saw the pictures that he put up, and one I'd never seen before, and that was a picture of what is St. Joseph's Church presently, but he showed you the interior as the Dutch church. And then he flashed, and I thought a little condescendingly, Rob, of the gaudy Catholic interior that, you know, would follow after it. And we all chuckled. We thought it was funny. But that represented the transfer of that land was a very symbolic representation of the coming into its own of this new culture, and that it was in fact going to prevail. And two, it was sort of symbolic of the way these transfers were going to have to take place in the middle of the 19th century. So you had Luke Noon, who had come over here from Ireland, had this phenomenal stone business and had prospered, and he was friends with a general from the Civil War who was a trustee of the Old Dutch Church. I have his name in here at some place. And they were friends, and the general was sympathetic to it and said, look, you know, we built a new church. The state used the armory, used that building as an armory throughout the Civil War. It's there, it's not serving any purpose. And Luke Noon said, I want to buy it for church, because the Catholic community, and I'm not even talking about St. Mary's yet, but the Catholic community was down in Wilbur, and we're coming up that was the Stone Road that went through uptown Kingston, down Wilbur Avenue to the docks down in Wilbur, and that's where the bluestone was unloaded. And we have a picture of that. Quite a feat, huh? Bringing that slab, supposedly one of the largest ever to be cut out and transported down to, and that looks like it is down on Lower Broadway, but at any rate, they talked to Luke Noon, and Noon bought it. He was a very reputable businessman in the city, well known, and he bought it and then later transferred it over to the Archdiocese of New York for St. Joseph's. In St. Mary's, which was the main Irish church in Kingston at that time, on the top of the hill where that cross is today, if you notice, you go down Wirt Street and you see churches on every side all the way down, because the D&H Canal, recognizing the need for this immigrant labor and anxious to have good relations with them, they had laid out half the streets in the roundabout, were willing to deal with these cultures, because a church is an expression of a culture that comes from another place and is brought in here. Did that, donated land for churches up and down Wirt Street, with one exception. It would not, and St. Peter's came later, St. Peter's is there, but it would not give that property to St. Mary's. So Again, they went over and they bought property separately, and they built St. Mary's at the crown of the hill of Broadway instead, looking down over the Roundout. What made it possible for the Irish and the Germans especially to be absorbed into Kingston society? More than anything else, it was the Civil War. Because America, the North, desperately needed soldiers. And there's plenty of stories about the draft riots in New York City where people would be getting off the boats, fleeing the famine in Ireland, and immediately be recruited or shanghaied or end up the next day in a Union boat going south to fight the Confederacy. So that ability to provide soldiers to augment the native regiments that were already coming out of Kingston and the Roundout was a big leveling of the discrimination and the feelings, the hard feelings between the two communities. And certainly many of those Irish rebels, because Ireland had a revolt in 1848 too, came over here and ended up as generals. And so many of the immigrants ended up, because they were in leadership positions, they ended up in leadership positions in the Union Army and fought for the Union, and when they came back, they were accepted into those communities. It probably lasted and lingered. There was resentment that lingered as far as the First World War. And then with the end of the First World War, if you look at the lists on those, and I'll show you that slide of the monuments, you will see the Irish names, the Italian names, the German names are the overwhelming number of names that make up the regiments that serve in those wars. So between that Civil War and World War I, you had this transformation. But before the Civil War, you had an extraordinary amount of tension and hatred and vilification between these communities. The Italian Americans came over in slightly smaller numbers a little bit later, and it was as part of Garibaldi's movement in Italy displaced so many of the old, so if you had and I want to say Sardinia, if you had an area that had been ruled by the French for a long time and all of a sudden was liberated by Garibaldi and the armies of Victor Emmanuel and was going to be in a completely new situation, if you had been on the wrong side in one of those armies, you were leaving. And many, many did. And they came to Kingston, following in the footsteps of the Irish and Italians, and they formed their own societies, and they formed their own cultural groups, and they took over their own geography. One of the things I like to do is put up a map of Kingston and show you the village, and then show you some streets in the Roundout, and then as it progresses, you begin to see the streets begin to fill in as more and more of the population comes up, originally on boats at the Roundout, but then eventually on the railroads coming through the middle of Kingston. Now, what I would like to think is that where it all comes together, where it becomes the society that we have a contact with, that maybe we are descended in this room, is in the middle of the city. Because it represented, it represented the merger of two different types of society. It represented the merger of that village of Kingston, which was still a product of the original inhabitants, and the village of Roundout, which had grown as a result of the D&H Canal. It was there because there was job opportunities. It was there and populated, and at a certain point, bigger than Kingston, because it was more tolerant. It had more business entrepreneurs. It had people who came. We had at least 3 very prominent beer breweries in Kingston. And let me see what I got here. Bear with me just a little bit. So here is one, and it's George Houck and Son. You had, Ed, help me out, the one on Baumans Brewery. Baumans Brewery, what a phenomenal story Baumans Brewery is. You know, that had the tunnels going out from it, that had, during Prohibition, that had fire hoses running through the sewers, providing beer to a hungry, I know, through the sewers, right? But all right. We're going to come here to this particular stained glass window. This stained glass window is at Temple Emmanuel. It's in the entrance lobby to Temple Emmanuel, which already has, if you know that building on Albany Avenue, you know it has beautiful stained glass already. But set in the middle is this window taken from the original synagogue, which was down on Abeele Street, and is there still today. It's sort of all closed up. It's had a number of different lives to it, but it's all closed up now. But they took the stained glass window out, and actually it was given to Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel started down on the Roundout, and they were immigrants. They were Eastern European Jews who came to Kingston looking for the same opportunity and leaving behind the same sense of persecution and intolerance that would mark the life of the Jewish community in Europe for the next 100 years. And they founded, it was a group of families. And they didn't go to work in the brickyards. They were businessmen. They opened small shops. Let's see if I have it here. I don't. But they came together and wanted to preserve their heritage, their religion, and so they formed Temple Emmanuel, and originally it started off as a very conservative and Orthodox congregation, and then it became a Reformed congregation, and certainly is one of the premier religious institutions in the city of Kingston today. The German population, when it came in, really was split into three sections. You had the Catholic Germans, and they were represented at a national parish at St. Peter's, right there on Wirt Street. You had Lutherans, the German Lutheran, very significant part of the German immigrant population was Lutheran, and you had Trinity Lutheran right down there off Wirt Street. I think there were actually two German Lutheran churches down there. And then you had the Jewish German churches, or going over actually into Poland. You didn't have the national boundaries that you do now. So you had a conglomeration of a number of different types of geography. And they were the ones who came and brought with them their rich Jewish heritage, and that is thriving in the city today. All of them found, these groups, found after an initial period of intense opposition, that simply by participating in the Civil War, by participating in the school districts of the city of Kingston, and eventually becoming part of city government, they became the police officers and firemen, just like they did in New York City, that they were eventually incorporated into the city. By the time of the First World War, they are the overwhelming population of Kingston. The neighborhoods that you would have known or heard about from your youth, those neighborhoods that had the little candy stores on the corner, dotted with grocery stores, dotted with bars, little neighborhood bars, and working in their neighborhoods in one of the factories, whether it was a shirt factory or it was a cigar factory, you really, that was Kingston. That was Kingston in the 1930s, Kingston in the 1940s, Kingston in the 1950s. So that was the population had merged, the population had become dominant, immigration population. I want to tell you a couple stories, though, because I think these illustrate the point better than I can do. One was of the Right Reverend Monsignor Richard Birdsell. Now, he had originally been an immigrant himself, and he was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of New York down in New York City. And he got caught up in the reform movement that was sweeping through New York. So you had Garibaldi was there, and Carl Shirtz was there, and you had all the Irish going in there, and the church certainly got itself involved. It was not strictly, whether it was Old Dutch or Jewish, it's not strictly a religious organization. The church has a political and a cultural involvement in the community. So he got involved in reform politics down in New York City. And he was on the losing end of it as far as the Archbishop of New York was concerned. So he said, I have a great parish for you. It's up in Kingston. It's about as far away as I can get you from Manhattan. And he is probably the most famous of the pastors that is included. The pastors of St. Mary's in Kingston includes a bishop of Albany, a bishop of Trenton, but Birdsell was probably the most famous. He was associated with the theological movement of Americanism, which spread throughout the Catholic Church in America in the late 19th century. Americanism was in advocating the introduction of democratic principles into the governance of the church, a reaction perhaps to the nativist movement, which we talked about. And it was also a notion at odds with the centralization of authority. So you had the Pope in Rome, very threatened by this Italian liberation and this Italian new movement. And you have this guy, this priest in Manhattan, who is advocating more democracy, not just in the government of New York City, but also in the government of the church himself. The movement was condemned by Leo XIII, and the leaders suffered a major loss of power. He was an intellectual. He had been to Rome. He taught in Rome, but he lost the battle, and he was sent to St. Mary's in Kingston. He was exiled to Kingston, where he would serve as pastor from 1890 to 1912. So great was his local reputation as a theologian, and so beloved was he as a pastor, that thousands of people would greet him whenever he returned from a trip outside the city. These are immigrants. These are people for whom a church building and a church community is the most important thing in their lives at that time. And he went to Rome to deal with Leo himself, and when he came back, it was his anniversary, they actually had a torchlight parade greeting him down as the boat pulled in and brought him up to the church. But perhaps no other immigrant family had a more symbolic impact on the city than that of Irish immigrant farmer John O'Reilly. In 1860, he shared a rare distinction with only one other immigrant, George von Beck, owner of the Roundout Brewery, largest of its kind in the United States. Both men were listed amongst the wealthiest in Kingston, a distinction usually reserved for only the oldest of Kingston families. Both were immigrants. His $30,000 worth of assets included a rolling, wooded section located on Broadway, west of Roundout, which overlooked both Roundout and part of the old village of Kingston. The property swept towards the old stockade and the plains of the Esopus. It was known as O'Reilly's Woods because there was a heavy concentration of pine trees. And it was on a rocky outcropping of O'Reilly's Woods that the symbolic marriage of the villages of Kingston and Roundout found its full expression in the construction of a new city hall. Across the street and facing City Hall, Also on the former O'Reilly property stands Kingston High School. A listing of institutions either part of or next to O'Reilly's property include Kingston Hospital, Benedictine Hospital, the Water Department, the Central Firehouse, the Department of Public Works, the Carnegie Library, the American Legion, the Knights of Columbus, City Hall, and the high school. The entire structure of government came together on this parcel of land between these two villages, and the entire government that we knew, because there used to be the bus station and, of course, the post office. All of these services were provided either on or adjacent to the land that had been owned by John O'Reilly, an Irish immigrant who had come to this country in the 1860s. And I think that really speaks of the immigrant experience and where it went in the city. That a population that was largely displaced from its native culture, forced to travel enormous distances to an unknown location where they received a very hostile reception because of their numbers, and introduced an entirely different culture, which by 1900 became the dominant culture in the city. I want to show you a couple of pictures. This is City Hall from the lawn of the high school, and it is the end of World War I. And the city has turned out for the unveiling of a bronze plaque, which you can still visit today, in front of City Hall with a list of the names of those who had been lost in that war. Here is another picture of it. And you can actually see the arch, the edge of the arch under which they had marched when they came back from the war. This was probably the moment at which everybody came to realize that the immigrant experience had completely changed Kingston. I mean, we had seen, and there are wonderful pictures of Civil War regiments coming back, landing in the Roundout, having their pictures taken, but nowhere is the sense that as a city, the villages were merged, the city was incorporated, you had a brand new high school that had just been built across from a city hall that was relatively new, and a whole sense of municipal services. And the names were all the names of children or relatives of the people who had come here 20, 40, 60 years before. Here's a parade, and you can see it. It would be earlier than that, but it must have been right after the building of City Hall, because I think you have a horse-drawn trolley in there somewhere, and you can see them coming up Broadway. And you here have a picture of down in the Roundout, and it's empty, as you can see, but you get a sense of the narrow streets, the taller buildings, the alleyways, and the neighborhoods that were populated with those immigrants. And here's some of the symbols of what we have today. And again, I'm saying this because you can still touch this. This is history you can still feel and touch. The White Eagle of the White Eagle Hall on Delaware Avenue, St. Mary's Benevolent Society or Association, which is still like a private club, down in Pankaki on North Street. Not too many people come across this unless they go down there looking for it. It's not a through street. But they have the bazaar, and they carry on the traditions of their people and their fathers and their grandfathers. White Eagle certainly does at their bazaar on Delaware Avenue. And then we have one of the new entrers in this is the Rear Center for Immigration, Culture, and History. Now, I did some research on it. I wasn't able to really access any documents through the Rear, but they are a product of the Jewish Association of Ulster County, but it is intended to, they're the driving force behind it because it was a Jewish bakery, but it is intended to tell the story of immigration in the Roundout. There are a couple interpretive plaques down there now, one of which will tell you the story about how if you were here in 1855, fully one half of the people you would run into were not born in Kingston, were not descendants of Kingstonians, and half of them would speak either Gaelic Irish or a German dialect. So you would be in a place that you may not feel completely comfortable or feel that it was, you know, what is this place? So the Rear Center is going to do, I think, a tremendous job of interpretation of that history. You also have a new one being built. I didn't think they were going to build them, but the Irish Cultural Center is being built up on a Beale Street, and that is overlooking the Roundout, overlooking Island Dock down in the Roundout Creek, and that is going to be dedicated to preserving the traditions, the culture, the heritage of the Irish community. We have Paul Tully here, and he's involved with that, so there's a little commercial for Paul. You also have things like the Knights of Columbus building. You have some of the, you have the Germania Hall over on Greenkill with the Manicore and Damancore. So you have it. These are, and in some cases, you know, look, they're aging out. You know, the Archdiocese of New York is talking about closing or consolidating Catholic parishes in the city of Kingston. One time you had 5, now you have 4, and you may only end up having 2. And we went through this a couple years ago with the schools. So the expansionism that was there right up through the 1950s, where this culture was booming and expanding, and huge families were being educated in the school system, going to these churches, is now contracting. So this is the period of time where we're, you know, probably going to lose some sense of that tradition of Kingston immigration. But certainly in these societies and in the Irish Cultural Society, you know, that will be kept alive. I am going to stop at 6:26 by my little timepiece here, and I'm going to, you know, see if there are any questions. But I think Paul ONeill insists on coming back up here, and come on, it's all right.
I was going to say continue. Do you have? Well, first of all, Tom, thank you. And do we have any questions for Tom? I'm sure we have to have some questions. It was very thorough, but is it ever completely thorough?
No.
How did all these immigrants get the money to get over into this country?
And that's a good question. You know, what sparked it? To clear estates, for example, if you had a huge peasant population that was ever expanding, and you had a landed estate, and you could still grow corn and everything, but, you know, they were in great distress, you wanted them to go. You did not want to keep them there. And you certainly weren't going to pay to feed them. So what you were willing to do was to give them money to leave. And that's what they did. And they tumbled the cottages, and they would tumble the cottages, give you a couple dollars, and you had to go make your way, and it was a torturous journey from wherever you were just to get to a port that had a ship, and then you set sail. That was the Irish experience. I think in the sense of the German experience, I think there was more money to be had. I don't think they arrived here in as destitute a condition And the same would be for the Italian, which was a smaller number initially anyway.
Did the potato
Hold on.
famine extend into
Ted.
Europe also?
Ted?
I'm asking about the potato famine. I'm wondering whether it extended beyond Ireland and into Europe.
It did. The amazing thing is, you know, the potato is not a native Irish crop. It's native to Peru. And it was brought into North America, and it was introduced into Europe and the British Isles as a food staple because it is an amazing vegetable that provides an extraordinary amount of nutrients. And so the population said, this is great, we can pull this up, we can live on this, we have a small amount, we can survive. But it also imported the infestans that rotted the potato in the ground. And you know, they didn't know what that was. All they know was you could go out in the field and the field would seem to be fine one day, and you would go out the next day and there was this ungodly odor. And even if you dug the potatoes early, and they tried everything. Dig them up early, store them apart, keep them segregated from other crops, the potato failed. And in that final year of like 46, 47, it was total. There was no potatoes. Now it did spread into Europe, but one of the reasons that it spread so readily in Ireland was a climatic conditions of an amount of moisture, coolness that allowed it to spread right through, you know, airborne.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Italian experience, brickyards, etc.?
The at a certain point, and John Courts and the Courts mansion was a big part of this, and George Hutton, who partnered up with John Courts, they looked at the soil in Kingston, especially down by the river, and found that it was the correct mixture of a clay and sand that could be manufactured into bricks. And they opened up brickworks, and there was the Terry brickwork, and these went on really until the 1950s, 1960s. Let's look at that one. John Courts is actually in this picture. That's why I'm, yeah. It says Hutton Brick, but the man in the middle of the picture there in the suit is actually John Courts. He started it, and Hutton was an investor. Then when Courts became sick, he went on, had another career. He was a state senator and built that mansion, again, that you can go and see. And that ridge extends north of his mansion. And it had a railroad running alongside of it, and it had all the firewood necessary to keep the fires going, to fire the bricks and dry the bricks. And you can see the young kid there is barefoot to be able to smooth the bricks. So as the Italians would come here, they were directed to the brickyards and eventually the cement plants that catered. Again, it was a cultural thing. You know, you want to be a New York City fireman in the 1950s, you better be Irish and you better have a letter from your parish priest. And then you could be a fireman in New York City. In the case with the Italians, there was a connection between their culture, brickmaking, and this business. And although the owners were, you know, old stock, Yankee Protestants, the workforce was almost exclusively Italian, and then increasingly African American that were also brought in. East Kingston, Punkaki. What was Columbus Point eventually became Kingston Point. What was St. Mary's on the Hill, the big church on the hill, was Irish. They had their own association and their own little church right down there on North Street. And you could walk from Punkaki and go along a road past what was called Devil's Lake. Remember, it was so deep. We were all warned it was bottomless. Don't go in there. And then it was drained, and it was about 10 feet. But it would go right into East Kingston, and you've got St. Coleman's Church out East Kingston, and then churchyard after churchyard, and industry after industry, and that became their thing.
Along
You're
with
being
the
filmed
previous
for
question
posterity.
over here, I essentially immigrated from New York City to here because IBM paid my way. Did the Hutton companies and these other big, like the Ashokan Reservoir, did they pay for the workers to come here?
Well,
Because they were the IBMs of the day, right?
Right. Well, usually we say immigrant, we mean someone coming from another country. You got to put a line there somewhere, and usually we define it as someone coming from another country, not as somebody coming here to work for IBM. But your point is well taken, and I think in the instance of the Ashokan Reservoir, you are absolutely correct that they were paid a goodly sum and brought in from other parts of the country, from New York City and places like that, because this wasn't the only reservoir being built. Last of the homemade dams, last of the dams built with mules rather than big bulldozers. And that work was done, and villages were established, and they were company stores. And so, yeah, that was the IBM of that early part of the 20th century for sure. So to answer your question, some did. And I'm sure that some of the brickyards sent, we had this regular steamboat commerce between Kingston and New York City and Manhattan. And I'm sure they brought people up specifically to be employed in the brick industry, for example. Kingston was the center of a big organized labor strike in the 30s. I don't know, that it's really a topic for another day, but there had been big labor strikes in New York City, and the Triangle Waste Fire that had so decimated, that particular area of New York with those immigrants who were working there. The owners of the shirt factories moved them out of the city as a first step to getting away from the unions. We'll put them up in Kingston, the unions won't find them. Well, of course the unions found them, and they were organized, and there were at least 3 or 4 major shirt factories in Kingston, and organized labor came, and they did. They had a big strike in the 30s, and then almost all those factories became union workshops. But they were enormous employers of, at this point, not so much immigrants anymore, the children of immigrants. My grandmother worked in Jacobson's shirt factory. Half my family worked at Jacobson's. And her grandfather was the immigrant and came over in 1852 from Baden, was part of that revolution, got caught, left, had a little farm, then moved into Kingston. They were longtime Kingston residents. And she was there in the 1930s working, at Jacobson's. So it was not so much immigrants, they were settled Kingstonians at that point. They had arrived.
Any other questions? Okay, well, again, Tom, thank you. Thank you very much. And that was 200 years of immigration in an hour, and in a very impressive talk, because it is important. This is our legacy. Our immigration has made us what we are today. And as much as the conflict came between these groups as they encountered each other and eventually assimilated, has made us the special place that we are. So we really live in a wonderful place, and it is in large part because of the immigration. And Tom, that was an excellent, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. So again. And as most of you know, Tom was a prior presenter as well. And sometimes we have presenters that we just love so much, we got to have them back. And Tom is one of those. So again, Tom, thank you very much. And again, we want to also take the opportunity to thank everybody who really makes this possible. Again, we always start out with the Senate House Museum. Quite frankly, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them and their generosity. So Tom and Jacob and Alex and everybody, and Bruce is here tonight, and Bruce is actually going to be retiring at the end of June. So we want to all wish Bruce very well and thank him for everything he's done to make this possible. Again, we want to thank Bob Rizzo. Bob, again, for all of you who have gotten the DVDs, Bob does a wonderful presentation, very professional, and really has allowed us to take all these stories and keep them forever, commemorate them. We have them in libraries, we have them all over, so it's wonderful that we're going to be able to keep all of these presentations for posterity. And that's important, and Bob, we thank you for that. Bob also has a list in the back of all the DVDs, so if you want any of our past series or tonight, you can let Bob know and he can get those for you. We also want to thank his wife, Jean. Jean is, you see her running up and down, she's handing out flyers, she brings wine, she does everything. So Jean, thank you. We want to thank all the people who publicize this event. Again, most of you are probably here because of these people, and they've done a wonderful job and have really carried the banner. Again, we always start with Hugh. Hugh Reynolds really, again, he was waving the flag before there was a flag to wave. Jillian Fisher, Raleigh Green have all done a wonderful job publicizing our event. Friends of Historic Kingston has done a wonderful job. They always put on our events, and they do a wonderful job promoting the history of Kingston. Ulster County Tourism, Kingston Community Radio, Kingston Happenings, the Daily Freeman, Vivian Wadlin, Chester Hartwell always puts our information up on Facebook. Walt Wachowski and the Civil War Roundtable. They're always, all these people, and this is just to name a few. We thank everybody who makes this possible. Again, Kingston's Buried Treasures. Joe Tantillo. Joe does so much work, all the work with, for our presentations, the flyers, Ed Ford's Lunette Project, everything that we do, Joe makes look professional. So Joe, we thank you for that. Ed, of course, Ed Ford carried the flame for many, many years when he was probably the only one doing it. Ed, none of us would probably be here if it wasn't for Ed. So Ed, we thank you for everything you do. Ann Gordon, our Ulster County historian, Pat Murphy, Nina Poshupak, and again, Tom is a member of the Kingston Buried Treasures. So besides for everything he's done tonight in his past presentations, he does a wonderful job each and every month for us. JK Wine and Liquor, again, we always want to thank them. They're our official sponsor. But they really have been wonderful. They appreciate what we're doing. They wanted to make it nicer for everybody to come here and have a glass of wine or two if you wanted. So again, if you're going to be picking up a bottle of wine or something, stop in and say hello to them. And again, all of you. You know, we appreciate so much all of you. We wouldn't be here without you. And this really has become, you know, a community event. I know I always look forward to seeing everybody, and every month it's really a reunion. So we thank you for the appreciation you've exhibited for the series and for Kingston's history. You know, again, we live in a very, very special place, and it's because of people like you. So we thank you. And again, Tom, thank you very much. I'll tell you our upcoming presentations next month, June 20th. Our presentation will be the early stockade and its settlers, and it will be presented by Kingston historian Ted Dietz. Ted is usually here, and many of you probably know him. I will tell you, if anyone knows more about the early stockade, I'm not aware of who that person is. So Ted has done an incredible amount of work on it, and it's fascinating where the lots were that we know of, who was here. These are the people that really started Kingston, and then the reason, again, that we're all here. And on July 18th, our presentation is Our Buried Past, the Archaeological Treasures of Kingston. That presentation is going to be by archaeologist and Professor Joseph Diamond. Joseph, I believe, was the archaeologist who did the dig at the Person House several years ago, and as a result of his work, we really redefined where the boundary of the early stockade was. So he is going to talk about many of the artifacts that he has uncovered in Kingston that have really defined and given us the information on where we've come from. So again, everybody have a wonderful weekend. We hope to see you next month, and everybody take care. Thank you again.